So background on Ben and Kevin. So who should read this? A little bit of information about Kevin and I. I'm going to kind of gloss over that and get to the part that's really targeted like for iOS devs more, since that's sort of who I'm talking to. And that's the iOS dev tutorial. We'll get more into the convincing iOS devs and that stuff later on. But basically, the purpose of this whole part of the kit is to introduce iOS developers to how to navigate a Kotlin multi-platform project. There's a couple like specific things that we kind of decided not to do with this because there's a lot of other good content out there that does that already. So for instance, this isn't an introduction to the Kotlin language for a Swift developer. It's not an overview of all the similarities between Kotlin and Swift. There's a lot of that stuff out there already. And another thing that we kind of left out, even though it's extremely important, is Gradle, because it's just a big, deep topic. It's sort of something that is easier, at least as an iOS developer came to KMP, it was easier for me to learn in like a hands-on way. It's a difficult thing to kind of conceptually describe to people. And it's not really, strictly speaking, necessary for like your first foray for getting started if you're an iOS developer in KMP. We're going to use CampKit as an example in our tutorial here for a couple different reasons. The first one being that it's designed to just run out of the gate. We specifically made it that way. You'll be able to run it, any iOS developer will be able to run it from Xcode immediately. And if they've played around with Android in the past and they have Android Studio installed, they have an Android emulator installed, they'll be able to run it on Android also, like right out of the gate. And that's getting Android Studio installed and the emulator installed, running it, that's really the bulk of part one. And the reason that we divided it up into two different parts like that is because I think a lot of people just kind of like to get something running and then they can play with it and, you know, break it, put it back together again, do whatever changes they want. And then there's always part two that they can come back to and read if they want and get like a little bit of a more in-depth explanation on like some of the concepts around KMP, that kind of stuff. Another reason to use CampKit is that it has some organizational architectural opinions built into it that we already agree with. That's why we built it that way. And having said that, though, we understand, like, especially if you're already working on an existing project, these opinions might not be in place yet, but it's sort of still a good introduction. It's kind of meant to be readable and easy to digest. So we don't really spend much time running the iOS side. You're an iOS developer, you should be able to do that already. And so then we went on to part two, which, like I said, kind of gets more into the structure of the project. At this point, you should, after getting through part one, you should be running on at least iOS. And if you're interested, also Android. We also make it clear that you don't have to run it on Android. You can be building your Kotlin library and running on iOS, and maybe that's all you want to do. Maybe you have no interest in Android whatsoever, and you just want to use a shared Kotlin library, consume a shared Kotlin library. Another big focus of part two is just sort of explaining Android Studio, directing your attention. It's like a whole new IDE, right? There's a lot of tools. It's a big, complicated new thing. And so you kind of want to learn to filter out what you don't need to know for your first time in there. So we point your attention to exactly where you need to look. And probably, in my opinion, the most important thing that we go over in part two is some of the tooling that we've done at Touchlab to make this experience better for iOS devs. A really good example is our fork of Kotlin Cocoa Pods. And probably the best example, thing that's the most helpful, is our Kotlin debugger Xcode plugin. So you can actually set breakpoints and get some color highlighting in Kotlin files that are recognized as source files by Xcode. Last two things we go over, we point to you to CamKit's docs. There's a lot more information in there. These other tools we point to, they also are self-documented. They have more detail and information. And finally, it's kind of a segue into some like the questions that you guys might have. We describe like some of the limitations on the iOS side, which are there, and we're open to discussing them with you guys. So yeah, Eric.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Ben. And I forgot to mention, we're going to be sending this later today. So you'll have the opportunity to kind of, look at everything that kind of Ben has put together and the approach that we're recommending if you're an iOS developer kind of getting started. So we'll be sending that shortly. Again, if there's any questions that you may have so far on what Ben just walked through, please drop them into the comment section. And now we'll kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the questions that we've received already and just kind of open it up for discussion. One of the parts of the kit that we're really excited about is our advice that we're giving to clients that we work with on how to approach speaking to iOS developers around KMP and how to, different pieces of advice that we give on how to get that part of the engineering organization involved. So the first question I kind of have to our team is what advice are we giving to orgs? And this is a question to Kevin to maybe start off with. What advice are we giving to orgs on how they should be bringing in the iOS portion of the team and speaking to them and kind of getting them familiar with the technology?
It kind of starts with taking a step back and thinking about, especially if we're talking to the engineers in particular, but in general, as an engineer, right? Like if I'm an Android engineer, or if I do React, or if I do whatever, like having someone else come in and say, hey, like we got this other thing that's great, and we're going to do this, and we're going to take stuff away from what you need to do, is generally not well received. Developers tend to be very experienced in their thing, identify with their things quite a bit. And this is true of people in general, right? So it's having some empathy for how you would react in a similar situation. Generally advise finding folks who are curious about the technology to be involved in the pilot, especially in this particular case of doing native mobile. Any production system with native mobile is complex. So adding something to that is going to be difficult. And an Android developer who probably doesn't do a lot of iOS stuff, trying to do something inside of a production iOS environment is going to be difficult at best, and also, again, not necessarily received well unless you have cooperation of the evaluation from the team. So it's getting them on board. But it's also keeping in mind that, as Jesse Wilson, but it gives developers superpowers to be able to contribute to other parts of the code base. And it's not just an Android developer contributing to iOS. It goes both ways. And it's part of why we have the Xcode plugin, because we don't want to say, hey, not only there's a whole new technology thing, we have to install all these tools you don't know anything about. And it's all going to feel very Android-y, right? The Xcode plugin exists so you can start touching the code without having to do stuff you're really not super excited about. And it's just a bunch of little stuff like that, but essentially get people on board to start thinking about themselves more as mobile developers on an individual level for career advancement, assuming KMP gets to be a big deal. Being an iOS-focused developer who's got experience in this world is going to help their careers individually immensely over the next 5+ years, whatever the time scale is. And also, I catch myself saying this. You try not to say iOS developer or Android developer. Try to focus on becoming mobile developers. And even one of our clients did a great thing. Like the first time you contribute shared code, they give you some kind of a gift, like a mug or something. Little things. Well, pre-pandemic, I guess you get to ship the mug now, but stuff like that. Don't just shove in there and be like, hey, here's this thing. Because an iOS developer is going to feel very like, wow, there's this Android thing that you're making me like do now, and I don't like this at all. So part of that is also recognize when you get feedback. Some of it is, I don't like this. This isn't great. This isn't going to be ideal. And then some of it's very reasonable. And there certainly are, it's not perfect. But some folks are just super not excited. And you have to recognize that in some of those contexts, the goalposts may be moved continuously. Like you solve a problem, and then there's just another problem. There's always going to be something that's not perfect. So you have to know where you're at. And sometimes it's not a winnable debate. Maybe take a different approach.
And I want to go back to something you said. Just quickly, can you give the folks on the Zoom and that are going to be watching this just a quick synopsis on what the Xcode plugin does, just so everyone's aware? And because I definitely want to highlight that option, that tool, to everyone that's kind of considering. Just kind of give us an overview of what it is and where it's at today.
So it is essentially, it does two things, and we call it a plugin, but that is, I don't know if it's an entirely appropriate term for it because Apple shut down plugins for the Xcode ecosystem, but they shut down plugins that are like active. So you can't edit code, I mean, you can't like instrument code. That's where the problem came. What this plugin does is it tells Xcode that Kotlin is a source file. It provides for source coloring so that not just a bunch of, white text. It is, so you can see Kotlin keywords and all that, and allows you to put breakpoints and do visual debugging in Kotlin code. We very intentionally stopped there because this isn't intended to be the best editing experience possible for Kotlin. JetBrains builds tools for that kind of stuff. So it's like leave the experts to do those things. This is intended to be, as an engineer, if you're used to Xcode and this Kotlin stuff is suddenly put in here, rather than having to go off for weeks on end to learn this whole new language just to install a bunch of tools, it is to start as a read mostly, get familiar with Kotlin because you can check through the code, debug it, and see it. And it's very similar syntax to Swift, so it should be immediately recognizable and lightly editable. If you want to move beyond that point, it's best to install the JV tools and get to work there. Ben just has gone through updating the install scripts, which, Apple doesn't make it super easy to add this kind of stuff to Xcode. And kind of test too. Ben, any thoughts on that?
Well, it should be easier again with next big update to Xcode. That's the good news, right?
So that tool and some of the other R&D that we've done around the topic of Kotlin Multiplatform and iOS is actually the third part of the kit. There's a running list there that will, as I said, continue to update that has links and links in particular to the Xcode plugin. So if you're interested in that, that sounds like it'd be valuable. You'll be able to find that information in the kit. All right, want to switch a little bit and kind of focus on Ben's experience here. You have an iOS background. You're now working a lot in Kotlin Multiplatform. Can you just walk us through the journey? What have you learned? What were some of the biggest obstacles? What makes you excited about the work that you're doing now? Just kind of give us your perspective as an iOS developer that is now really a mobile developer.
Yeah, so I would say I did start off as an iOS developer who was like enthusiastic, or definitely at the very least like very open to exploring all this stuff. There's a couple reasons for that. I mean, some are selfish, some aren't. Like Kevin's right. Like there are major career advantages to it. I mean, for one, I have come away learning a lot about the Android environment. So there's that, but then there's also the advantage of just sort of being early into something, being an early adopter of something that is set to grow, right? Like specialization is really how you get ahead. So those are like the selfish reasons for it. The unselfish reasons, what was kind of cool about it was just starting off with like feeling like I already had a foot in the door with Kotlin. Like Kevin said, like it is readable, like pretty much from day one. If you're a Swift developer, I actually kind of joked. I realized this much later on that it had been a while since I'd played with Objective-C when I started looking at Kotlin. And the first time I was looking at Kotlin, I was like, oh, this is like pretty easy to read already. When I went back to Objective-C, that like took longer for me to kind of adapt to, which is, you know, like not usually considered like the prettiest language. But I would say the biggest learning curve has been the IDE, which, like Kevin just sort of pointed out, we've made it optional basically with the Xcode plugin. But it is a big new environment. It's very powerful. There's a lot to learn with it, but
and what are you?
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, no, go ahead, finish your thought.
Oh no, go ahead.
What are you focused on now? Like what's your near-term kind of explorations that you're doing on the iOS and KMP kind of intersection?
Well, like Kevin said, I've been working on the debugging plugin recently. Now I'm actually kind of poking around in Kotlin native to see if there are ways that we can't improve the sort of user experience for iOS devs. Maybe like see if what we can do with the header, the Objective-C headers, that might help iOS devs learn a little bit easier, just make it a little more readable and elegant.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Ben, for that. That's super helpful. All right, I've got some questions here. Again, if anyone has a question, drop it in. If not, we'll just kind of go through some of these questions that we've already received from the folks that have registered for the kit. This is kind of a fun one, and it's not something that we always see, but what's the approach like for adding Android support for an existing iOS application? How would that process look different if they're looking to kind of, right now there's only an iOS app and they want to expand to Android and use KMP for it? What are some of the approaches that we think would work well there?
Yeah, it is an interesting use case. I'll be interested to see how much that happens out in the wild. But one of the interesting parts about KMP is that it's really like cross-platform, only on the iOS side. The Android side is Kotlin. Kotlin is the preferred language for Android. So part of sharing code is not writing it more than once. But the other part of sharing code is not having to maintain two separate pieces of code and morph them over time. So first, establishing the value of trying to do this is if you can consolidate your code bases, that will be valuable from a maintenance perspective in the long term. You are likely, if you're going to implement Android from an existing iOS app, you're going to have to write that code in Kotlin. You're going to have to do this work. So doing that in a way that allows you to then like surgically remove that piece that you've added from the iOS code and share that code accomplishes that goal of reducing the cost of maintenance over time, right? Now, how would you go about it? It is kind of a similar way to how you would go about trying to share code in existing code bases anyway, which is don't try to take the whole thing at once. And that is one of the big benefits of this type of code sharing, is that you don't have to do all of it. It's optional. So take a module, take something that you really want to port over first and try that out just to see how that process works, to put that, see how calling back into that from your iOS code works. We tell people, databases is something like, I haven't met too many iOS engineers who are super excited about core data. Some exist, sure. Start with a database module, perhaps a business logic module, obviously, and you can, along with sharing the code, you can share tests, which is also useful. And we talked to people starting with things like analytics. It's something that, as a developer, you don't get a lot joy return on the output of it, because it's not for you, it's somebody else gets to see the thing, but you got to get it exactly right or the data is not very useful. So people are using it for that kind of thing. Anyway, pick a module to start with, see how that works, and kind of expand from there. And you, depending on the size of your teams, depending on the size of your apps, you can more or less share everything up to the UI or just parts. Depends what you want to do. And that goes to advice of, like, general advice of how to do code sharing. It's like, it doesn't have to be everything, as opposed to adopting some of the technologies that are in the cross-platform space, which we don't really consider KMP cross-platform, but that's a different discussion.
I don't know, anything to add to that, Ben? Or you don't have to?
I mean, that was sort of a, more in-depth look than what I was thinking of. What I kind of just thought was, KG's right. Like, if you're starting with iOS, you're going, whatever it is that you want to share, you'll have to write that in Kotlin, right? Then you've got a good start. You've got presumably some business logic for your Android side, right? Like, that's a foot in the door. So you're sort of already on your way.
Yeah, no, it's a great use case and something that we're going to keep track of to see if that comes up more, because that's one of the questions that we have. I have two questions now to kind of wrap up that are more about the future of KMP. The first one we got from the audience that reads, thank you for submitting it, Zoha131. KMP now supports Objective-C. Is there any plan to support Swift directly?
We should differentiate plan versus timeline. And there's definitely a plan. It has come up in discussions. It's definitely on the radar. But I'm sure there's no timeline, and that is, I don't even need to ask JetBrains. I'm sure that they don't have a time, right? I will throw out that we need to keep in mind, and one of the biggest things that I address it early on. I know that we're sort of, people that want to stay in sales mode would try to avoid the problems, but I feel like developer folks want to know problems first. Kotlin isn't Swift, and for all their visual similarities, there are definitely differences. So there are things that direct Swift interop will improve, but it will not change that. Like, you won't get value types. You won't automatically get enums and associated values. You won't get all the same things. There are Kotlin equivalents to these structures, but I think we're going to have to build sort of nuanced expression bridges for us that are going to be sort of outside the context of just direct Swift interop. But that's a much longer discussion. But yes, it's going to be available at some point, but we have to be realistic about what that's going to solve versus other approaches, which are going to be more prominent as compiler plugins mature, which is coming in 1.4 and that kind of stuff. So, big topic.
And then the last question on a kind of similar overall topic, there's been some big news recently around the updates to the Kotlin native memory management model, right? Where do we think that's going? And what were your reactions kind of to that initially, Kevin? And I know you wrote a post about it, but for the folks on here that maybe haven't read it, just kind of give us your overview on that.
Surprise, stages of grief, kind of. No, so if you've been at all following what kind of what we've been doing, I've been talking about the concurrency and the state model and sort of explaining that to people over the series of several conference talks and blog posts over the last couple of years, right? I liked the intent of what they were attempting to do with it, which was to have safer concurrency. And I didn't really find the model to be that confusing once you understood it. However, flip side is if I have to spend a couple of years explaining it to people, perhaps it's not that simple. And I think finally that argument has won out internally. So I think whatever is going to improve adoption is a good thing. I also would point out that if you read about what they're doing, it's not like it's just going away. They're exploring ways to align still some safer concurrency and maybe more typed language level stuff, but have it be standard across the JVM and the rest of the targets. Because frankly, it is confusing. If you do something in the JVM and you run it for native, they don't run the same. It's not the most obvious thing in the world. I do think it's good for adoption. It is going to be, there's no timeline, Roman gave no timeline in that blog post, and people should be aware. It is not coming like a little later this year. It is a long time window. So if you plan on getting started with KMP and you're just going to wait a couple months, that's not what's going to happen. It's going to be a while. I would say that what we're going to focus on with our explanations, I'm going to stop explaining it in detail. And I think we're going to start focusing on how to do specific things inside your apps such that, you don't have to change anything when this new model arrives. It shouldn't really impact you in any significant way. And that's the thing I think people have to keep in mind. Like, you can code today as long as you follow good best practices and immutability in general. Like, you shouldn't be mutating your data along streams and all that kind of stuff. If you're careful about that and you understand how to architect stuff, you don't make it too complicated. Yes, you're probably not going to have to change anything when this change comes. But if you're going to want to do anything in the next, say, year, you're definitely going to still be in this original model. So long term, good. Short term, adjustments.
Perfect. All right. So we're out of time. But the last thing that I want to kind of remind everyone is, as I said, we'll be sending this out shortly. And it doesn't stop here, right? This is going to be an evolving document. And after you've had time to digest it and kind of go through Ben's tutorial and kind of go through our thoughts on talking to your iOS developers about this, if there's any questions, we'll be fielding questions in the CampKit support channel. We link out to that in the PDF. So any questions around that are iOS specific or just in general, please use that channel and definitely use us as a resource because we're, big on community and helping out the community as much as we can. So with that, thank you to Ben for putting this together and walking us through it today. We're super excited that this is going to be one of the first pieces that we have and we'll continue to expand. Thanks, Kevin, as well for everything and kind of answering the questions that we have. And then thanks to the audience for joining us today. And have a great Friday. Have a great weekend. And we'll see you guys on Twitter and in Slack and in the digital world. Please stay safe. Thanks again, everyone.